Okay, in this video, we're going to create a sway bar. So the first thing we want to do is make a new constraint. So I'm going to come down here and we're going to use this ball joint to create a new constraint. So I'm going to let me move my cursor here. And then I'm going to do Shift D along the Y and move it right there. And let me come into a side view. Then we're going to make a cylinder. Scale it way down. I'm going to move it to here. Selection active. And I'm going to move it up some. Scale it down a little bit more. Scale it along the Z. About right there. Then I'm going to add a mirror modifier to this ball joint. So mirror. We'll pick the Z. And we'll pick our cylinder. There we go. Let me apply this modifier. Then let's select all that. We want to join all the mesh together, and we also want to set the origin to the center. Let me bring up this. Let's zero out the Z like that, so it's along the Y-axis. And there we go. So this is going to be we'll call it a Z-link, because that's the only constraint it's going to have. So hashtag Z-link, and should already be a rigid body constraint, but if it's not, make it one. And we don't need it to be a spring, it just needs to be generic. And we want to uncheck X and Y. There we go. All right, now let's start making our sway bar. For that, let's make a new collection, and we'll call it sway bar. Okay. And I'm just going to go ahead and make a copy of this constraint, move it up here. Then I'm going to move my cursor there. And let's make let's move this out some along the X to about right there. Then let's make a rigid body now. The rigid body for the sway bar. So let's make a cylinder. I'm going to scale it down quite a bit, and then I'm going to rotate it about the X. Rotate it about the Y, like that. I'm going to move it about right here. I'm going to take my sway bar constraint. I'm going to copy the X location. So let me just copy that. And I'm going to align it with this, or align the rigid body by copying its position. All right, let's tab into this, and let's add a cube to this mesh. So I'm going to move it about right here. This does not have to be exact. I'm going to scale it along the Y, about right there, and that looks pretty good. So your mesh should look something like this. We do want the origin to be right here, so leave it like that. Okay, now let's get the other two constraints. Actually, let's first name this. So this is going to be a rigid body, so underscore sway bar. There we go. And let's get a couple more constraints. We want an axle, and for the first time, we're going to use this torsion spring. So select those, press Shift D, and then Shift S, or Shift S, selection of cursor. Here we go. All right, before we move those, let's go ahead and mirror these objects. So I have my sway bar selected, Shift D, escape, then make the X location negative, and the same thing with this constraint. Shift D, escape, and make this negative. There we go. Okay, select both of these and press Shift S, cursor to selected. Now we can move both of these there. Selection of cursor, and we're going to move the axle somewhere more like here. And we're going to rotate this torsion spring RY 90. So it's aligned like that. We can scale it down a little bit too. Let's copy this constraint, Shift D, escape, make the X negative, and there we go. All right, let's do our connections here. So let's pick these new Z-links, as we call them, and we'll just connect them to the rigid body. Same thing with this side. And these axles are going to connect just the rigid body. They'll probably connect to the subframe when we attach them. Oops, messed that up. Don't connect them to each other. So this one needs to be connected to here. And the spring is going to connect both of them. So we want this one, and I think I did that wrong. Yep, connect both the rigid bodies. Okay, let me just do that again, or make sure that's all correct. So these Z-links should be connected to the sway bars. The axles should be connected to the sway bar. And the torsional spring should be connected to both sway bars. Okay, let's do some parenting. Let's parent both these two constraints to the rigid body on each side. Okay, and we'll just parent this one to just pick the left side. Okay, so now everything should move properly. All right, so that looks good. Let's go ahead and add some armatures. So I'm going to select this armature, Shift D, move it over here. I'm going to rotate it about the Z, R, Z 90, and I'm going to move it to this rigid body. Shift S, selection active, then move this alignment sphere to here, selection active, and then we want to parent the rigid body to the armature bone. So select the rigid body, then the armature, go into pose mode, select this bone, press Ctrl P, and bone, like that. Let's go back into object mode. And let's select all of this, and we'll copy it, Shift D, and then move it to this side, Shift S, selection active, and we want to parent this one to this armature. Go into pose mode, select this bone, Control P to the bone. Okay. Now let's add some constraints. Oops, go back into object mode. So let's add a constraint to this alignment sphere. Copy location, pick this one, invert the X. This one, the same thing. Copy location, this one, invert the X. So now we move this. We can move along the Y or make it wider. And the same thing with this. Only want to move this probably along the Y like this to make it longer or shorter. So that's how that works. Let me select all this and make sure it's in the right collection. So I have it all selected, right click, move to collection, select sway bar. I'm going to save this.